The corrupt judge thought he had the perfect plan: frame an innocent black man and make sure he never sees freedom again. With a rigged jury, fake evidence, and the entire system on his side, the case was as good as closed. But just as the final verdict is about to be read, the courtroom doors swing open, because someone powerful is watching. Someone with the power to turn the entire trial upside down. The White House is calling, and what they reveal will shake the entire nation. What secret is hiding behind this case? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Jordan Carter traced his finger along the timeline projected on the classroom wall, his shadow dancing across the faces of civil rights leaders who stared back at his students, faces that had changed America forever. The afternoon sun filtering through the windows cast a warm glow across the classroom, making the images seem almost alive. A gentle breeze stirred the papers on his desk, carrying with it the sweet scent of blooming dogwoods from the courtyard. Remember, change doesn't just happen. These leaders stood up when others wouldn't. They faced violence, jail, and death because they believed in something bigger than themselves. Each one of them knew the cost, but they paid it willingly for future generations. Their courage wasn't just about the moment, it was about building a better tomorrow for all of us. Maya Rodriguez leaned forward in her front row seat, scribbling notes with the same intensity she brought to her school paper articles, her dark eyes bright with purpose. Her pencil moved rapidly across the page, capturing every word. Through the classroom door's window, Jordan caught sight of his daughter Nia's braids as she waited in the hallway, bouncing on her heels with characteristic impatience, her backpack covered in colorful pins and badges. The bell's sharp ring cut through his closing thoughts, echoing off the walls. Don't forget your essays on the Montgomery bus boycott are due Friday. I want to see your best analysis of how ordinary people created extraordinary change. Think about the ripples one person's courage can create. Students filed out, backpacks slung over shoulders, chattering about the lesson, while Maya lingered behind, clutching her notebook to her chest. Her enthusiasm was contagious, lighting up her whole face. Mr. Carter, that was amazing. I never knew about your grandfather's work with... Two police cruisers screeched to a halt at the school's entrance, cutting her off. The sound of squealing tires and slamming doors echoed across the quiet campus, startling a flock of birds into flight. Jordan stepped outside, his heart dropping as officers spilled out, their boots heavy on the pavement, one already reaching for his cuffs with practiced efficiency. The afternoon sun glinted off their badges like warning signals. Sheriff Wayne Caldwell emerged from the lead car, his badge gleaming in the sunlight, a cruel smile twisting his face. His heavy footsteps seemed to make the ground shake. Jordan Carter, you're under arrest for the murder of Robert Whitmore. Murder? What are you talking about? Jordan's voice remained steady despite the fear gripping his chest. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the accusation. The pavement slammed against Jordan's cheek as officers forced him down, rough hands pressing into his back. Phones appeared in students' hands like flowers blooming after rain, their cameras capturing every brutal moment. The concrete scraped against his skin, hot and rough. Dad! Nia's scream tore through the air, raw with panic. Let him go! Her voice cracked with emotion, tears streaming down her face. Maya's fingers flew across her phone screen, her hands trembling but determined. Free Jordan Carter. They're arresting him for nothing. Her voice carried across the growing crowd, steady and defiant. Officers dragged Jordan to his feet, his shirt twisted and dirty. Through the growing crowd, he saw the divide, some faces horrified, others satisfied, as if they'd been waiting for this moment. The whispers and gasps formed a chorus of shock and judgment. Students huddled together, some crying, others filming, their faces a mix of confusion and outrage. The backseat of the cruiser felt like a cage, the leather seats cold against his skin. Jordan watched his daughter collapse into Maya's arms, his students clustering together, their phones raised like shields against injustice. The courthouse rose ahead, a stone monster ready to devour him, its shadows growing longer in the afternoon light. Its massive columns seemed to mock everything he'd just taught about justice. Sheriff Caldwell's eyes met his in the rearview mirror, cold and triumphant. You're done, Carter. His words dripped with satisfaction. years of hidden hatred finally finding their moment. Metal doors clanged shut behind Jordan as officers marched him through the Crestwood County Jail's dimly lit corridors. His wrists burned from the too tight handcuffs, each step echoing off concrete walls covered in decades of grime and despair. The air hung heavy with the stench of industrial cleaners and hopelessness. Premium accommodations for murderers. A guard shoved him forward, forcing him to stumble. The holding cell door scraped open with a metallic shriek, and rough hands pushed him inside. The space reeked of sweat and defeat, packed with black men sitting on metal benches or leaning against cold walls. Some stared blankly ahead, while others whispered among themselves. An older man with graying temples looked up, recognition dawning in his tired eyes. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on his thin frame. "Mr. Carter? The teacher?" His voice dropped low, thick with disbelief. "They got you too? Man, I remember when you taught my grandson. You're the last person I'd expect to see in here." Across town in his mahogany-paneled dining room, Judge Monroe swirled aged bourbon in a crystal glass, savoring its amber glow in the dim evening light. The massive flat-screen TV mounted on the wall blared breaking news about Jordan's arrest, its blue light casting harsh shadows across Monroe's satisfied face. Police found compelling evidence at the crime scene, including a bloody handprint matching Carter's dimensions. An anonymous witness places the suspect outside Mr. Whitmore's office around the time of death. Monroe's lips curved into a satisfied smile, deep wrinkles forming at the corners of his mouth. To justice served. He raised his glass, the expensive bourbon catching the light. David Monroe watched his father's celebration from across the room, his own drink untouched. His stomach churned at the familiar scene. Another innocent life about to be destroyed by his father's machinations. The planted evidence, the fake witness. He knew the playbook by heart. Each case added another weight to his conscience. Back at the jail, Thomas Grady's expensive loafers clicked against the floor as guards led him to the meeting room. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air. His hands trembled as he opened his briefcase, spreading papers he barely glanced at. His usual confidence nowhere to be found. Jordan leaned forward, the metal chair cold beneath him. "Thomas, what's going on? Talk to me." Grady's voice shook, barely above a whisper. His eyes darted to the security camera in the corner. "They told me if I fight too hard, my family pays for it." Fear painted every word. "I'm sorry, Jordan. I'm so sorry." Alone in his cell later, Jordan stared at the ceiling, the weight of reality crushing down. Moonlight filtered through the narrow window, casting prison bar shadows across his face. The system wasn't built for justice, it was built to break people like him. But he refused to let it break his spirit. Outside those walls, Maya's video spread like wildfire across social media platforms. Thousands retweeted the footage of his brutal arrest, their outrage growing with each share. Celebrity activists shared it with millions of followers, adding their voices to the rising chorus of protest. Justice for Jordan climbed Twitter's trending list, a digital storm brewing against Monroe's carefully constructed kingdom. In her bedroom, Maya watched the numbers climb, hope mixing with determination as she prepared her next post. Maya's fingers flew across her keyboard, her heart racing as the retweet numbers climbed into the thousands. Her hands trembled with a mixture of excitement and fear as notifications flooded her screen, each ping a reminder of the growing momentum. The hashtag number Justice for Jordan Carter was trending nationally now, spreading like wildfire across social platforms. Her phone buzzed, a direct message from Olivia, lead investigative reporter at the National Times. "Your video of Jordan Carter's arrest is powerful. Would you be willing to talk? This story needs to be heard. The public deserves to know the truth." 1,000 miles away, Ava Carter's coffee mug crashed to the floor of her Chicago apartment, dark liquid spreading across the hardwood like an oil spill. Her Instagram feed filled with shares of her brother being slammed to the ground by Crestwood police, his face pressed into the asphalt. Her stomach lurched at the sight of Sheriff Caldwell's boot pressing against Jordan's back. Her hands shook as memories of the town she'd fled flooded back. The whispered threats, the burning crosses. The late-night phone calls that had sent her family scrambling to check the locks. 10 years of carefully constructed distance crumbled in seconds. At Crestwood High, students poured out of classrooms, their voices echoing through empty hallways like thunder. No justice, no peace. Signs bearing Jordan's face bobbed above the crowd like beacons of hope, some decorated with his most inspiring quotes from class. Maya stood at the front, megaphone in hand, her voice steady despite her pounding heart, leading hundreds of her classmates toward the courthouse steps. The sea of young faces behind her carried determination that couldn't be intimidated. Local news vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Camera crews jostled for position as Reverend Jackson, a longtime civil rights leader, stood with other activists, organizing the growing crowd of protesters, his experienced hands guiding the younger generation. Parents and community members joined the students, their numbers swelling by the minute. Judge Monroe paced his chambers, face red with rage as he watched the coverage unfold on multiple screens. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he watched his control slip away, decades of carefully maintained power threatening to unravel. This wasn't supposed to happen. One black teacher in a small town shouldn't have caused such upheaval. His carefully constructed system was showing cracks, and the whole country was watching. "Get me the police chief," he barked into his phone, spittle flying. "We need to control this narrative. Release his personnel file. Find something. Anything. Make him look unstable. Plant evidence if you have to. I don't care what you have to do." Hours later, police spokesman Tom Walsh stood before cameras, his rehearsed words falling flat. "We're investigating reports of concerning behavior from Mr. Carter's past. Several witnesses describe incidents of aggression." His voice wavered slightly, betraying his discomfort with the lies. Behind him, Sheriff Caldwell stood with arms crossed, his face a mask of practiced authority. The lies spread, but so did the truth, racing through social media feeds and text messages faster than Monroe's machine could contain it. Video clips of Jordan's inspiring classroom moments surfaced alongside testimonials from current and former students. Hundreds gathered outside the county jail, their chants rising above the evening air like a prayer. "Free Jordan Carter! Free Jordan Carter!" In his cell, Jordan pressed his palm against the cold wall, feeling the vibration of voices outside. Tears welled in his eyes as the chants grew louder, each voice a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. He thought of his students, his family, and all those who had suffered under Monroe's reign of injustice. Monroe's fingers gripped his phone tight enough to whiten his knuckles, his jaw clenched in fury. The control he'd maintained for so long was slipping through his fingers like sand. "Sheriff?" he growled into the receiver, his voice thick with barely contained rage. "This ends tonight, whatever it takes. Use any force necessary." Sheriff Caldwell's boots crunched on broken glass as he surveyed the courthouse steps, a satisfied smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. His planted agitators had done their job well, turning a peaceful protest into manufactured chaos. Men in dark clothing, their faces obscured by black bandanas, hurled bricks through windows while his deputies stood back, cameras rolling to capture the violence. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the square like twisted applause, a symphony of destruction that made his chest swell with dark pride. "They're attacking the courthouse," Caldwell's voice boomed through his megaphone, barely masking the pleasure in his tone. "Disperse immediately or face arrest." He watched with growing satisfaction as panic began to spread through the crowd like wildfire. Tear gas canisters arced through the air with soft whistles before exploding into clouds of burning mist. Students scattered in panic, coughing and crying, their eyes streaming. But Maya Rodriguez stood her ground, phone steady as she live-streamed the truth, her hands trembling but determined. Her camera caught everything: the mysterious men in black starting the violence, the police hanging back until the perfect moment, the peaceful protesters being attacked without provocation. The acrid smell of tear gas burned her throat, but she kept filming, knowing this might be their only chance to expose the corruption. "Look at the badges," she narrated, voice steady despite her racing heart, zooming in on uniformed figures directing the chaos. "They're not even from our district. These aren't our local police. They brought in outside forces to do their dirty work." Her stream reached hundreds of thousands within minutes, the viewer count climbing rapidly as people shared her footage. Celebrity activist Marcus King shared it to his 20 million followers. This is how they silence the truth. Justice for Jordan. Crestwood corruption. The hashtags began trending nationwide, a digital wildfire that couldn't be contained. Inside his mansion, Judge Monroe slammed his fist on his mahogany desk, causing his crystal whiskey glass to rattle. The amber liquid sloshed dangerously close to the rim. How hard is it to control one protest? He glared at the room full of nervous allies, police chiefs, local politicians, business leaders, their faces pale in the dim light of his study. Decades of careful control were slipping through his fingers like sand. We're losing control of the narrative. Sir, social media, one began, mopping his sweaty forehead with a handkerchief, his voice quavering. I don't care about Twitter, shut it down, all of it. Monroe's face had turned an alarming shade of purple, veins bulging at his temples. His empire was crumbling, and he knew it. In his cell, Jordan traced patterns in the concrete wall, cut off from the world outside, his fingertips following the grooves left by countless prisoners before him. The rough surface told stories of pain and perseverance. Footsteps approached. His lawyer returned, looking different. Gone was the fearful tremor, replaced by an energy that filled the tiny cell with electricity. Something's happening, the attorney said, eyes bright with hope. This isn't just local anymore. The whole country's watching. Your story is everywhere. In Washington, D.C., Secretary of State Elliot Hayes scrolled through his newsfeed, the glow of his tablet illuminating his face in the darkened office. His coffee cup clattered against his desk as he saw the name Carter and recognized Jordan's face. Memories of a night decades ago flooded back. A young boy running from an angry mob, saved by Nathaniel Carter. The debt he'd carried all these years suddenly felt like a weight pulling him to action, a chance to finally make things right. His fingers shook as he reached for his phone, determination settling over his features like armor. Get me the president, now. The time for sitting on the sidelines was over. Justice had waited long enough. Elliot Hayes' hand trembled as he stared at his phone screen, the name Carter burning into his vision like a brand. The dim light of his D.C. office cast long shadows across his face, memories flooding back with crushing force. The leather of his chair creaked as he shifted, his breath catching in his throat. 50 years melted away in an instant, the weight of the past pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. He was 12 again, running through the dark streets of Crestwood, heart pounding, legs burning. The mob's torches flickered behind him, their shouts echoing off wooden houses, the hate in their voices making his blood run cold. The sound of heavy boots on pavement grew closer with each passing second, like thunder rolling in. The rope they carried swung like a pendulum in the night air, a silhouette of hatred against the star-filled sky. Then Nathaniel Carter appeared, a guardian angel in the darkness, his strong hands pulling him into a hidden cellar beneath the church. The musty air filled his lungs as they huddled together in the shadows, the sound of footsteps overhead making them both hold their breath. Stay quiet, son, Nathaniel had whispered, pressing a finger to his lips. His eyes held a mix of kindness and steel, a look that had stayed with Elliot all these years. God didn't put us here to hate. Those words had become a compass for Elliot's life, guiding him through decades of public service. Hayes' fingers found the old scar on his shoulder, a jagged reminder of that night, of the debt he carried. His hand steady now with purpose, he punched in the Attorney General's number, his jaw set with determination. The clock on his wall ticked steadily, marking each precious moment. John, we need to review the Crestwood case. Now. Hayes' voice carried the weight of decades of political authority, each word sharp and clear, cutting through the late-night silence. Elliot, you know we can't interfere with local jurisdiction without cause. Cause? I've got viral videos showing police corruption, planted evidence, and a judge with a history of racial bias. What more do you need? His voice rose with each point, echoing off the mahogany walls of his office. The family photos on his desk seemed to watch him, witnesses to this moment of truth. The Attorney General's silence spoke volumes. Hayes ended the call with a sharp tap and dialed another number. this one connecting directly to the White House, his heart thundering in his chest like that night so many years ago. In his cell, Jordan traced his daughter's name on the wall, each letter a prayer carved into the concrete with his fingernail. Nia's face haunted his dreams, her screams as they dragged him away echoing in his ears. The memory of her small hands reaching for him made his chest ache with an emptiness that seemed bottomless. Outside, the protest chants grew louder, a chorus of voices demanding justice. But inside his concrete box, Jordan felt more alone than ever, the walls closing in with each passing hour. The presidential line rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Hayes gripped his desk, knuckles white against the polished wood, determination coursing through his veins. "Mr. President, I apologize for the late hour, but this can't wait." He took a deep breath, steadying himself, feeling the weight of history in this moment. In 30 years of service, I've never made a personal request. But this case? It's personal. His voice carried the echo of that long-ago night in Crestwood. The president's chair creaked as he leaned forward, the sound carrying clearly through the secure line. "Tell me everything," he said, and Hayes could hear in his tone that he had his full attention. Meanwhile, Judge Monroe's fist slammed against his mahogany desk, rattling the law degrees that lined his office walls. The TV blared in the background, national anchors dissecting Jordan's case with increasing scrutiny. His phone buzzed for the 10th time in as many minutes, another text from David Henderson, the bank president, threatening to withdraw support. The carefully constructed facade he'd maintained for decades was crumbling before his eyes, and he could taste bitter defeat in his mouth like acid burning his throat. "This ends now." Monroe jabbed at his phone screen, Sheriff Caldwell's number appearing. Sweat beaded on his forehead as his voice cracked with barely contained rage, his face flushed red with anger. "Handle this. I don't care how. Just do it." His hands trembled as he loosened his silk tie, feeling the walls closing in around him. The weight of his empire felt heavier than ever on his shoulders. In the police station's back room, Caldwell gathered his most trusted officers, men who'd helped him maintain order through force for years. Their badges gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights as he laid out his plan, their faces reflecting the same brutal determination he'd handpicked them for. The air was thick with tension and unspoken understanding. "Visit each juror. Make sure they understand what's at stake." He cracked his knuckles, a habit from his boxing days, pacing the room like a caged animal. His heavy boots echoed against the linoleum floor. "And those protesters? Show them what happens when they challenge the natural order." The officers nodded silently, their expressions hardening with practiced menace. Each man knew exactly what was expected of them. They'd done this dance before. Across town, Ava Carter's rental car crawled past familiar streets she'd sworn never to see again. Each passing house stirred memories she'd tried to bury, like ghosts rising from their graves. The old Victorian house loomed before her, paint peeling in long strips, shutters hanging crooked against dirty windows. Her mother's garden, once vibrant with life, lay choked with weeds and dead flowers, a painful reminder of everything that had withered away in her absence. The key still worked. Some things never changed. Inside, dust covered everything like a shroud, the air thick with neglect and lost years. Family pictures hung askew on the walls, their glass clouded with grime. She climbed the creaking stairs to her mother's study, where papers still littered the desk as if waiting for someone to return. The musty smell of old books and forgotten memories filled her nose, making her eyes water. A yellowed envelope caught her eye tucked behind an old family photo. Her mother's handwriting sprawled across the front in faded blue ink. Evidence, Monroe cases. Inside, she found a detailed letter describing decades of rigged trials, with references to hidden case files that could expose everything. Names, dates, and damning details jumped off the pages as her heart raced while scanning page after damning page. Ava's hands shook as she read the final lines, the paper crinkling beneath her trembling fingers. The letter offered a clear choice: walk away or fight. She looked at the family photo again, at Jordan's young face smiling back at her, so full of hope and trust. His eyes seemed to pierce right through her. The choice was already made. After years of running, it was time to stand and face the storm. She tucked the envelope into her jacket pocket, its weight against her chest feeling like both a burden and a shield. Moonlight filtered through the courthouse's dusty windows as Ava crept down the marble hallway. Her footsteps echoed despite her best efforts to stay quiet, each soft tap seeming to bounce off the high ceilings and ornate walls, making her wish she'd worn softer shoes. The records room key, borrowed from her old high school friend turned clerk, felt cold and heavy in her palm, a constant reminder of what was at stake. She clutched it tighter, drawing strength from its solid presence, trying to ignore the way her hands trembled slightly. The ancient door groaned as she pushed it open, the sound making her pause and listen for any response. Her pulse quickened as seconds ticked by in silence, each heartbeat thundering in her ears. Row after row of metal filing cabinets stretched into the darkness, their brass labels barely visible in the dim light from her phone. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she moved deeper into the room, scanning the years until… there. 1975 to 1998. Closed cases. The cabinet loomed before her like a sentinel guarding its dark secrets, its metal surface cool and slightly rusted beneath her fingertips, decades of hidden injustice sealed within. "Please work," Ava whispered, hands shaking as she inserted the small pick into the lock. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she worked the mechanism carefully, remembering the techniques she'd learned years ago during a misspent youth she'd rather forget. A click, then another. The drawer slid open with a metallic screech that made her wince and freeze in place for several long seconds, her muscles tense with anticipation, ears straining for any sound of discovery. Inside, manila folders packed the drawer tight, each one carrying a black man's name. Some she recognized, neighbors, friends' fathers, faces from church, people who'd simply vanished from the community over the years, leaving behind confused families and unanswered questions, all convicted by Monroe. Her throat tightened as she flipped through them, seeing the same pattern repeat: flimsy evidence, coerced witnesses, rushed trials. The sheer number of cases made her stomach turn and bile rose in her throat. Each folder represented a life destroyed, a family shattered, a community wounded. Then she saw it. Carter Jordan. The folder was crisp, new, dated 3 months before Robert Whitmore's murder. Her blood ran cold as she opened it, the paper crackling beneath her trembling fingers. The moonlight caught the fresh ink still dark against the pristine pages. Inside lay detailed plans, planted evidence, fake witnesses, even a script for the arresting officers. Monroe had orchestrated everything, planning her brother's downfall with chilling precision, his hatred evident in every carefully typed word. The level of detail in the conspiracy made her feel sick. Ava's hands trembled as she stuffed the files into her messenger bag, careful not to bend them despite her rising panic. Each one felt heavy with the weight of ruined lives, of families torn apart by Monroe's twisted justice. She could almost feel the pain and suffering contained within those pages, years of systematic oppression documented in cold, official language. The fabric of her bag strained against the volume of evidence that could finally expose decades of corruption and bring hope to countless families. Her fingers brushed against each folder with reverence, knowing these documents held the power to change everything. A door creaked in the distance, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. Footsteps echoed through the empty courthouse halls, growing closer with each passing second, the steady rhythm like a countdown to discovery. Ava's body went rigid, her breath caught in her throat as fear paralyzed her. The footsteps stopped just outside the records room door, and she could see a shadow moving in the gap beneath it, dark and menacing against the strip of moonlight on the floor. Her mind raced through possible escape routes as she pressed herself against the filing cabinet, willing herself to become invisible in the darkness. On the other end, the president's fingers drummed against his mahogany desk as he flipped through the classified report, each page revealing more disturbing details about Judge Monroe's reign in Crestwood County. His jaw tightened as he absorbed the scope of the corruption. Hundreds of cases, all targeting black defendants, all following the same pattern of fabricated evidence and coerced testimonies. The sheer volume of ruined lives made his stomach turn, and the detailed accounts of families torn apart left him struggling to maintain his composure. The photographs of broken homes and tearful children particularly haunted him, reminding him of promises he'd made during his campaign. "This goes back decades," he said, looking up at his chief of staff, his voice thick with barely contained anger. The muscles in his neck strained against his collar. One judge, systematically destroying lives, and we let it happen. Right here in America. His chief of staff shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "Sir, small-town politics are usually—" "Don't." The president's palm slapped against the desk, making the pen holder rattle and a framed family photo wobble. "This isn't politics. This is evil, plain and simple. And it ends today." He reached for his phone, punching in a number with decisive force, his fingers trembling with controlled rage. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the presidential seal on the carpet. "Get me the Attorney General. Now." His voice carried the weight of authority that had won him the presidency, echoing off the Oval Office walls. "And prep Air Force One. I want boots on the ground in Crestwood by morning. Every agent, every resource we have, whatever it takes, we're going to tear this whole corrupt system apart." Dawn broke over Crestwood's courthouse as black SUVs rolled into town, their federal plates gleaming in the early light. FBI agents in dark suits stepped out, their badges catching the sun as they marched toward the building. Their faces were set with grim determination, briefcases filled with warrants and evidence. Local residents stopped in their tracks, watching with a mixture of fear and hope as justice finally arrived at their doorstep. Some pulled out their phones to record the moment, while others simply stood in stunned silence. Monroe stood at his office window, coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips as he watched the agents approach. The cup slipped from his fingers, shattering against the floor, dark liquid seeping into the expensive carpet like spreading ink. His hands began to shake uncontrollably as decades of carefully maintained control dissolved. For the first time in 30 years, real fear gripped his heart. His empire of corruption was crumbling before his eyes, and he knew there would be no escape this time. In his cell, Jordan woke to the sound of keys rattling against metal. The door swung open with a harsh creak, the fluorescent lights from the hallway casting long shadows across the cramped space he'd called home for too many nights. "You've got a visitor," the guard muttered, avoiding eye contact, his demeanor markedly different from the usual swagger. His keys jingled nervously at his belt as he stepped aside. Jordan stepped out cautiously, his prison shoes squeaking against the polished floor, his heart pounding with unexpected hope. The familiar institutional smell of disinfectant filled his nostrils as he walked down the corridor. There, standing in the hallway with his hands clasped behind his back, was Secretary of State Elliot Hayes, a man whose presence promised that everything was about to change. A slight smile played at the corners of Hayes's mouth, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a long-awaited victory. Jordan sat in the cold metal chair, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead in the jail's visitation room. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, his shoulders slumped from nights of fitful sleep on a thin prison mattress that felt more like concrete than bedding. His prison uniform, stiff and scratchy against his skin, felt like a constant reminder of his situation, the orange fabric a daily mockery of his freedom. The smell of industrial cleaner and stale air hung heavy around him, a cocktail of despair and disinfectant that seemed to seep into his very pores. Across the table, Secretary Hayes adjusted his tie, his presence both commanding and oddly familiar. The man's silver hair and pressed suit seemed out of place in the stark institutional setting, like a rose blooming through concrete, a splash of dignity in a colorless world. "Your grandfather saved my life once," Hayes said, his voice carrying the weight of decades-old memories, soft but firm like weathered oak. "It's time I return the favor." His weathered hands clasped together on the metal table between them, knuckles whitening with intensity, years of political battles evident in every wrinkle and age spot. Jordan's jaw tightened, muscles working beneath his skin. He'd heard too many empty words from men in expensive suits, promises that evaporated like morning dew. The bitter taste of disappointment was all too familiar, coating his tongue like old coffee. "With all due respect, sir, I've learned not to trust government promises." Hayes leaned closer, his eyes fixed on Jordan's, determination radiating from his steady gaze. The fluorescent lights caught the deep lines around his mouth, etched by years of political battles and late-night negotiations. A hint of earnestness softened his expression, making him look more like a concerned father than a powerful politician. "The president himself is involved now. We're launching a federal inquiry into every case Monroe has touched. Every single one. Politicians make a lot of promises." Jordan's fingers drummed against the metal table, the hollow sound echoing in the small room like a tired metronome. "Especially when cameras are rolling." His words held the weight of countless broken promises he'd witnessed over the years, each one a small betrayal. "Monroe isn't just corrupt. He's scared." Hayes' voice dropped to barely above a whisper, his breath fogging the space between them like secrets taking shape. "That's how we win. Fear makes men like him sloppy, desperate, and desperate men make mistakes." Across town, Monroe paced his chambers, watching FBI agents through his window with growing panic. They moved with methodical precision, carrying boxes of files from the courthouse like ants dismantling his carefully constructed world. His expensive leather shoes wore a path in the carpet as he watched his empire crumbling, the steady tap-tap-tap matching his racing heartbeat. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, nearly knocking over a crystal tumbler on his desk, the amber liquid inside sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning, trickling down his temples. "Caldwell," he barked when the sheriff answered, his voice sharp with barely contained panic. "Handle this situation, whatever it takes, whatever the cost." His voice cracked on the last word, betraying the fear he desperately tried to hide. The phone nearly slipped from his sweaty palm, his manicured fingers struggling to maintain their grip. As guards led Jordan back to his cell, he noticed their changed demeanor, the shift subtle but unmistakable. They avoided his gaze, their usual swagger replaced by nervous glances and uncertain steps, like actors who had forgotten their lines. Something had shifted in the air like the calm before a storm, electric with possibility. The familiar echoes of his footsteps down the corridor seemed to carry a different weight now, each step ringing with possibility, a rhythm of change in the making. Outside the jail, Sheriff Caldwell gathered his most trusted officers in the parking lot, their breath visible in the cool night air. Their faces were hard, determined, illuminated by the harsh security lights overhead like players on a shadowy stage. They checked their weapons with practiced movements, exchanged knowing looks, the metal of their badges glinting dully in the artificial light. Steam rose from their coffee cups in the cool night air as they huddled closer, their whispered conversations carried away by the wind. Caldwell's cruiser lights cast eerie shadows across their faces as they clustered together, preparing for something dark, their expressions masks of grim determination. The night air crackled with tension and unspoken intentions, thick with the promise of violence to come, like thunder before a storm breaks. The protest swelled under the courthouse's stark floodlights, hundreds of voices rising in unified chants that echoed off the brick walls. Maya's phone captured it all, faces illuminated by candlelight, signs bobbing above the crowd like paper waves, the electric energy of hope and defiance crackling through the night air. Students and citizens pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breath mingling in the frigid evening as they demanded justice. The crowd stretched far beyond the courthouse steps, spilling onto the surrounding streets like an unstoppable river of humanity. "We're live with over 10,000 viewers," Maya announced to her fellow students, her breath visible in the cold. Her hands trembled with excitement as she panned across the scene. The courthouse steps filled with people holding phones aloft, their screens reflecting like stars against the darkened sky. Behind her, the chants grew louder, more determined. "Justice for Jordan," they called in rhythmic waves that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. Blue and red lights strobed through the darkness, casting eerie shadows across worried faces. Police cruisers rolled in from every direction, engines growling as they boxed in the crowd. Officers emerged in black tactical gear, face shields gleaming, batons at the ready. The atmosphere shifted from hopeful to tense in an instant. Parents pulled their children closer, and elderly protesters who remembered similar scenes from decades past shook their heads in dismay. "Clear the area immediately," Sheriff Caldwell's voice boomed through a megaphone, his words dripping with barely contained rage. "This is an unlawful assembly." His face twisted with satisfaction as he gave the signal to his officers. The first tear gas canister arced through the air with a metallic ping, leaving a trail of smoke in its wake. White smoke billowed across the courthouse steps, burning eyes and throats. Screams erupted as more canisters followed, turning the peaceful scene into chaos. Officers charged forward, swinging batons indiscriminately at anyone in their path. Elderly protesters stumbled. Young students tried to help them up, only to be struck down themselves. "Keep recording," Maya shouted as she stumbled back, eyes streaming from the gas. Her phone shook but stayed steady, documenting everything. A news reporter crumpled nearby, his camera clattering across the pavement as an officer's boot connected with his ribs. She could hear his pained gasps as he tried to crawl away from the onslaught. Ava pushed through the panicked crowd toward Maya, her heart pounding with protective instinct. "We need to get you out of here." The baton caught her temple before she saw it coming, a flash of silver in the chaos. She dropped hard onto the concrete, blood trickling down her face as consciousness wavered. The world spun around her as concerned faces blurred above. Inside his cell, Jordan jerked upright at the distant sound of explosions, his heart racing. He rushed to the tiny window, pressing against the bars until they bit into his palms. "What's happening out there?" His fists pounded against the concrete walls, knuckles scraping raw. "Someone tell me what's going on." The guards outside his cell remained silent, but their tense expressions told him everything. One guard's radio crackled with urgent voices and the sound of chaos. The footage spread across social media like wildfire. Officers beating peaceful protesters, tear gas clouding the night air, bloody faces and broken cameras. Within hours, every major network carried the scenes of brutality. Hashtags trended worldwide as millions shared Maya's livestream, their outrage building like a tidal wave. Commentators spoke in hushed, angry tones about the echoes of civil rights battles thought long past. In his mansion, Monroe watched his television with hollow eyes as the White House statement scrolled across the screen. The administration strongly condemns the violent suppression of peaceful protesters in Crestwood County. His hands shook as he reached for his drink, ice cubes clinking against the crystal like tiny bells tolling his doom. For the first time in decades, real fear crept into his heart as he realized his carefully constructed world was crumbling. The phone beside him buzzed incessantly with calls from political allies already beginning to distance themselves from the growing scandal. Monroe stalked across his mahogany-lined study, crystal tumbler trembling in his white-knuckled grip as he watched the footage replay for the 100th time. The scenes of chaos played out on his oversized screen, each moment making his blood pressure rise. Protesters scattered like leaves in a storm, tear gas clouding the night air as riot police advanced with shields raised. His private phone buzzed, the governor's direct line, a call he couldn't ignore no matter how much he wanted to. "This stops now, Gerald. The whole country's watching." The governor's voice cracked with barely contained fury. "De-escalate or I'll send in the National Guard myself. Don't test me on this. You've gone too far this time." Monroe hurled his glass against the wall, sending crystal shards flying in a deadly spray. Amber liquid trickled down the expensive wallpaper like tears, staining the delicate pattern. His hands shook with rage as he dialed a familiar number, one he'd used many times before when he needed problems to disappear. "Marcus? Get to the evidence room. I need something concrete on Carter. Plant it if you have to, just make it stick, and make sure no one sees you." His voice dripped with desperation, a tone his subordinates had never heard before. In Washington, Elliot Hayes burst through the Oval Office doors, his usual diplomatic composure shattered, tie askew and forehead beaded with sweat. The Secret Service agents outside exchanged worried glances at his unusual state. "Mr. President, they're beating children in the streets. We need to move now. This can't wait another day. People are getting hurt." The president leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the news footage playing silently on multiple screens, each showing a different angle of the growing crisis. I'm expediting the federal inquiry, but Monroe's got friends in high places, Elliot. He won't surrender his power quietly. You know how deep this goes. We have to be strategic. In his cold cell, Jordan stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of helplessness press against his chest like a physical thing. The concrete walls seemed to close in with each passing hour. A guard's boots scuffed outside his door, followed by a hesitant pause. Carter. The guard slipped a phone through the meal slot, glancing nervously down the corridor. 2 minutes. Make it count. I'm risking everything here. They'll fire me if anyone finds out. Jordan's fingers trembled as he pressed the phone to his ear, heart pounding against his ribs. Ava's voice came through, urgent and low, filled with a mix of fear and triumph that gave him hope. Jordan, listen. I found files, decades of cases. Monroe's been rigging trials targeting black men. It's all documented. He's left a paper trail a mile long. We've got him this time. Hope surged through Jordan's veins for the first time in days, making him sit up straighter on his thin mattress. If we can get those files in the right hands, Monroe is done. This could change everything, not just for me, but for everyone he's hurt. Outside the jail, Monroe climbed into his black sedan, jaw set with grim determination. He adjusted his rearview mirror, eyes cold and calculating as he studied his own reflection. He had one more card to play, one that had never failed him before, one that would crush his opponents once and for all. His phone buzzed again, but this time, he smiled, a predatory expression that would have chilled anyone who saw it. That night, shadows crept across the courthouse walls as 3 masked figures slipped through a side entrance, their dark clothing blending seamlessly with the night. Their footsteps echoed in the empty halls as they made their way to the records room, guided by the weak beam of a small flashlight that danced nervously across the worn tiles. The lock clicked open with practiced ease, suggesting this wasn't their first covert operation. The musty smell of old paper and dust filled their nostrils as they eased the heavy door shut behind them. Find those files. All of them. The leader's harsh whisper carried through the musty air, tension evident in every syllable. Papers flew as they tore through cabinets and boxes with desperate intensity, decades of court records scattered across the floor like fallen leaves in an autumn storm. The sound of ripping paper and metal drawers scraping against metal filled the room as they worked with frightening efficiency. Ava's phone buzzed at midnight, jolting her awake from an uneasy sleep. The court clerk's message was brief but sent ice through her veins. Break in. Records room. Now. Her hands shook as she fumbled to get dressed in the dark, knowing exactly what this could mean for their case. She and Maya raced through the dark streets, their hearts pounding in sync with their footsteps on the empty sidewalks. The night air was crisp and biting against their faces as they ran. When they burst through the doors, the destruction hit them like a physical blow, stopping them dead in their tracks. Scattered papers covered every surface like fresh snow, filing cabinets lay overturned like fallen soldiers, and the acrid smell of burned documents hung in the air, burning their throats. The destruction was methodical and thorough, leaving no doubt about the perpetrator's intentions. No. Ava dropped to her knees, sifting through the wreckage with trembling hands. Most of the evidence was gone, shredded or burned beyond recognition, leaving only ashes and fragments of their hopes. But under an overturned desk, she found it, a single yellowed document, Monroe's original ruling that proved he'd tampered with a case years ago, a small victory in their overwhelming defeat. Her fingers clutched the paper so tightly it nearly tore, this one piece of truth surviving amid so much destruction. The morning news hit like a bomb, shattering what little peace remained. Jordan Carter's face plastered across every screen, beneath headlines screaming about a criminal conspiracy that seemed crafted from pure malice. Monroe's fabricated confession letter painted Jordan as the mastermind behind a gang responsible for a string of violent crimes, a web of lies so intricate it almost seemed believable. The news anchors delivered each accusation with barely concealed excitement, feeding the public's appetite for scandal. In his cell, Jordan pressed his forehead against the cold concrete wall, feeling the rough surface bite into his skin. The weight of the new charges crushed him, stealing the air from his lungs and hope from his heart. "They're never going to let me walk out of here," he whispered to the empty cell, his voice hollow with defeat, the words echoing off the bare walls like a final surrender. The distant sound of guards' footsteps in the corridor only emphasized his isolation, each step another reminder of his powerlessness against the system that sought to destroy him. The Justice Department conference room hummed with tension as Elliot Hayes faced a table of stern-faced officials. Morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wood surface. Coffee cups sat untouched, growing cold as the gravity of the situation settled over the room. The Attorney General drummed his fingers against a thick stack of preliminary reports from Crestwood County, his weathered face betraying years of dealing with difficult cases. His silver hair caught the light, a testament to decades spent navigating the complexities of American justice. The weight of countless similar meetings seemed to hang in the air, though none quite as monumental as this one. Taking down Monroe means exposing decades of systemic corruption. We're talking about judges, police chiefs, mayors, an entire network of officials across multiple jurisdictions. The Attorney General's face tightened, deep lines forming around his mouth as he shook his head slowly. The political fallout would be unprecedented. We're looking at careers destroyed, institutions shaken to their core. This could destabilize the entire region's legal system. The ripple effects could reach as far as Washington. Elliot leaned forward in his chair, his jaw set with the same determination that had driven him throughout his career. His hands clasped together on the table, knuckles white with conviction. The memory of his own brush with injustice decades ago fueled his resolve. Then let's burn the whole system down. It's time someone did. We've let this cancer grow long enough. Back in Crestwood, Monroe's fabricated confession dominated every news channel, playing on repeat like a broken record. The document painted Jordan as a criminal mastermind, complete with detailed allegations and false witness statements that grew more outrageous with each telling. Talk shows debated his guilt while social media erupted with competing hashtags. Number Jordan is guilty versus number Monroe is lying. The town seemed split down the middle, neighbor turning against neighbor, old friendships crumbling under the weight of suspicion and doubt. Even longtime church members chose sides, their Sunday potlucks becoming battlegrounds of whispered accusations. Federal agents combed through dusty archives and digital records, but Monroe's political machine worked overtime to block their efforts. Court clerks misplaced files with suspicious frequency, computer systems mysteriously crashed during crucial searches, and witnesses suddenly developed foggy memories when questioned. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined, its roots stretching back generations, feeding on decades of silence and fear. Ava clutched their one piece of evidence, the court document proving Monroe's corruption, as she and Maya slipped through back alleys toward the Federal Task Force's temporary office. The paper felt heavy in her jacket pocket, weighted with the power to expose decades of injustice. Her heart pounded with each step, knowing what they carried could change everything. The street lamps cast eerie shadows on the brick walls around them, making every movement seem threatening. Maya's normally confident stride had given way to cautious steps. A black sedan had tailed them for 3 blocks, its headlights reflecting ominously in store windows. Maya spotted it first, her hand squeezing Ava's arm in warning, fingernails digging into flesh. Her breath came in short, frightened bursts, fogging slightly in the cool evening air. They ducked into a safe house, an abandoned store owned by one of Jordan's supporters, its dusty windows providing perfect cover. Inside, they crouched behind old shelving units, hardly daring to breathe, surrounded by the musty smell of abandoned merchandise and stale air. Hours later, thinking they'd lost their tail, they emerged into the quiet street. The setting sun painted long shadows across the cracked pavement, while distant sirens echoed through the emptying streets. A black SUV rounded the corner, engine purring like a predator as it pulled up behind them. The door swung open with deliberate slowness, and armed men stepped out, their intentions clear in their measured movements. Their polished shoes clicked against the asphalt, each step bringing them closer to Ava and Maya. The streetlight caught the gleam of badges on their belts. Monroe's private security force, operating under the thin veneer of official authority. The van's tires crunched over loose gravel as Monroe's men roughly shoved Ava and Maya inside, their calloused hands securing thick black blindfolds over their eyes with practiced efficiency. The cold metal floor vibrated beneath them as they bounced along winding back roads, each sharp turn disorienting them further. Maya's shoulders shook with silent, terrified sobs, while Ava forced herself to stay calm, desperately trying to memorize the route through the oppressive darkness, counting seconds between turns and mentally mapping every bump and sway of the vehicle. The van jerked to a sudden stop, the brakes squealing in protest. Heavy doors slammed in quick succession. Multiple footsteps circled the vehicle like prowling wolves, their boots scraping against the ground with measured precision. Bitter cold air rushed in as the back doors swung open with a metallic screech that set their teeth on edge, and rough hands dragged them out into the biting night air. Their shoes scraped and stumbled against cracked concrete as they were pushed forward into what felt like a vast, empty space. The warehouse air hung thick with dust and decay, the musty smell making their noses twitch and their throats constrict. "Where are the files?" A harsh voice echoed through the building like a crack of thunder, bouncing off distant walls. Someone yanked off Ava's blindfold without warning, fingers catching painfully in her hair. Harsh fluorescent light stabbed her eyes, making her wince and blink rapidly against the sudden brightness. 3 men in crisp, dark suits loomed over her, their faces hard and emotionless with practiced intimidation, eyes cold as winter frost and just as merciless. "I don't know what you're talking about." Ava lifted her chin defiantly, meeting their threatening stares with unwavering determination, though her heart hammered wildly in her chest. Maya whimpered helplessly beside her, still blindfolded and trembling like a leaf in a storm. "Please, I just want to go home," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper, cracking with fear. In Washington, Elliot's phone buzzed against his desk, the vibration seeming to shake the entire room. The threatening message glowed ominously on his screen. "Back off, or they disappear." His weathered hand trembled as he read it again, his heart pounding against his ribs as decades of political experience told him this was no empty threat. Jordan paced his tiny cell like a caged animal after his lawyer delivered the devastating news about Ava and Maya's abduction, his footsteps echoing off the bare walls. His fists clenched until his knuckles went white as bone, muscles taut with helpless rage. The gray concrete walls seemed to close in around him as helplessness threatened to overwhelm his sanity, his thoughts racing with worry for his sister and former student, imagining countless horrific scenarios. But in the warehouse, Maya's phone lay forgotten in her jacket pocket, its camera silently recording everything through a small tear in the fabric. The live stream count ticked steadily upward, hundreds, then thousands of horrified viewers watching the scene unfold in real time across the nation, their collective outrage building like a tsunami. The first helicopter's deep thrum vibrated through the warehouse's metal walls like an approaching storm, a sound of both threat and promise. Monroe's men froze in place, heads tilted toward the growing sound, their confident facades cracking. More choppers joined the first, their powerful searchlights cutting through the high windows like avenging angels, casting stark shadows across the warehouse floor. Heavy boots pounded the ground outside as FBI tactical teams swiftly surrounded the building, their weapons ready and their commands sharp and clear in the night air. The warehouse doors exploded inward with a deafening crash, sending splinters of wood and metal flying through the air like deadly shrapnel. Smoke grenades hissed and bounced across the concrete floor, their metallic bodies scraping against the rough surface as they filled the cavernous space with thick gray clouds that billowed toward the ceiling. FBI tactical teams poured through multiple entry points, their rifles sweeping the space with practiced precision, green laser sights cutting through the haze like searchlights in fog. "Federal agents, everyone on the ground now." The command echoed off the walls, authoritative and demanding. Monroe's men scattered like roaches in bright light, their expensive shoes squeaking against the floor in their desperate attempt to escape. One of them, panic clear on his sweat-streaked face, drew his weapon with trembling hands and fired wildly into the smoke. The sharp crack of gunfire echoed off metal walls, the sound amplified in the enclosed space until it was almost deafening. Return fire answered in controlled bursts, disciplined and precise, the tactical team's training evident in every shot. Maya screamed and dropped to the floor, her hands covering her head as her heart hammered in her chest. Ava threw herself over the girl without hesitation, using her body as a shield as bullets whizzed overhead with deadly intent, close enough that she could feel the displacement of air. Strong hands grabbed them both, pulling them toward safety behind a stack of sturdy wooden crates that smelled of sawdust and age. "We've got the hostages, area clear." The agent's voice was steady, professional. Outside in the cold night air, agents zip-tied Monroe's men face down in the gravel, their expensive suits now covered in dust and tiny stones. Inside, others discovered a paper shredder still warm to the touch, its motor giving off the acrid smell of overheated electronics, surrounded by mountains of destroyed documents. But beneath a heavy wooden desk, they found what they needed. One pristine file that had slipped behind a drawer, its pages yellowed but intact, detailing Monroe's systematic abuse of power spanning decades of corruption, each page a damning testimony to his crimes. Elliott's private jet touched down at Crestwood Regional Airport within hours, its engine still whining as he descended the stairs into the crisp night air. His face was grim as stone as he reviewed the recovered evidence on the drive into town, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned each damning page under the dim interior light of his town car. In his cell, Jordan found a folded note tucked inside his dinner tray, hidden beneath a slice of dry bread that crumbled at his touch. The handwriting was neat, precise, written in blue ink that seemed to shine under the fluorescent lights. Midnight. Visitor's room. Come alone. He tucked it into his shoe, heart pounding against his ribs like a drum, wondering what new development awaited him. Judge Monroe slouched in his leather chair, crystal tumbler trembling in his liver-spotted hand as he poured another finger of bourbon, the amber liquid sloshing against the glass. Empty bottles littered his study floor, their labels all bearing expensive names, a testament to hours spent trying to drink away his mounting fear. The room spun slightly as his phone lit up with an unknown number, casting blue light across his sweating face, highlighting every wrinkle and worry line. He fumbled with the screen, bringing it to his ear with unsteady hands that betrayed his deteriorating composure. "Hello?" His voice cracked, betraying his fear. "It's over." The voice was cold, final, like a judge's gavel falling, carrying the weight of justice long delayed. The phone slipped from Monroe's fingers, clattering against his mahogany desk as the line went dead, leaving him alone with his fear in the dimly lit study, the walls of his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Jordan's footsteps echoed through the empty corridor, each step reverberating off the cold concrete walls as the guard led him toward the private holding room. The harsh fluorescent lights cast strange shadows that seemed to dance and twist along the floor. His muscles tensed instinctively when he saw the silhouette of a man in an expensive charcoal suit waiting inside. His back turned to the door, hands clasped behind him in a stance that radiated authority and purpose. The guard's keys jingled metallically as he unlocked the heavy steel door, the sound sharp and jarring in the confined space. 30 minutes, he grunted with practiced indifference, closing it behind Jordan with a dull thud that seemed to seal his fate. The man turned slowly, revealing a clean-shaven face and steel-rimmed glasses that caught the harsh fluorescent light. His expression was carefully neutral, practiced in its professional detachment. "Mr. Carter, I'm Federal Prosecutor James Marshall." He extended his hand across the space between them, but his grip was firm and impersonal, businesslike in its brevity, lacking any hint of warmth or genuine connection. "We've gathered substantial evidence against Monroe, documents, testimonies, a pattern of corruption spanning decades." Marshall spread photographs and papers methodically across the metal table, his movements precise and deliberate like a chess player positioning his pieces. "But we need a face to this case, someone the public can connect with, someone who can make them understand what's really at stake here. We need you to testify." Jordan's throat tightened painfully, his heart hammering against his ribs. His hands curled into fists under the table as vivid images of Naya flashed through his mind. Her bright smile, her infectious laugh that could light up any room, her heart-wrenching scream as they dragged him away from their home that terrible night. "My daughter," he started, voice rough with emotion, heavy with the weight of a father's fear. "We can protect her," Marshall cut in smoothly, too smoothly, like a well-rehearsed line from a script he'd performed many times before. "Like you protected all the others Monroe went after?" Jordan's voice carried a bitter edge, sharp with the knowledge of countless lives destroyed by the judge's corruption. Across town, Elliot Hayes sat hunched in his temporary office, surrounded by towering stacks of evidence and case files that threatened to topple at any moment. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from eager reporters hungry for the story, each vibration a reminder of the growing media frenzy. But something felt wrong in his gut, an instinct honed by years of political warfare. The pieces were falling into place too easily, like a trap waiting to spring shut on unsuspecting prey. In his sprawling mansion, Monroe's trembling fingers dialed a number he'd sworn never to use, his usual confidence shattered like fine crystal on marble floors. The line clicked after one ring, as if someone had been waiting in the shadows for this very moment. "It's time," a deep voice answered from a darkened government office in Washington. The man's face remained hidden in shadow as he leaned back in his expensive leather chair, power radiating from his unseen presence like heat from a furnace. "I'll clean this up permanently." The order traveled through encrypted channels, passing through multiple hands until it reached its final destination, each step carefully orchestrated to leave no trace. In the prison's dimly lit security room, a guard's phone lit up with a simple but ominous message that glowed in the darkness. "Carter, tonight." The words hung there like a death sentence, waiting to be carried out. Moonlight filtered through the narrow window of Jordan's cell, casting pale shadows across the concrete floor. The night guard's boots made no sound as he moved down the corridor, his practiced steps betraying years of midnight rounds. His hand slipped inside his jacket, fingers wrapping around the cold steel handle of a concealed knife, a weapon chosen specifically for its silence. The air hung heavy with tension, thick enough to choke on. Jordan's chest rose and fell in the peaceful rhythm of sleep, unaware of the approaching danger. A thin prison blanket barely covered his shoulders, offering little protection against the chill night air that seeped through the aging prison walls. The guard paused at the cell door, key ring silent in his steady grip, his eyes cold and calculating. Metal scraped against metal as he unlocked the door with mechanical precision, each movement calculated and rehearsed, perfected through careful planning. The knife glinted in the dim light, its edge wickedly sharp, promising a quick and quiet end. One step, two steps. The guard's breath came in controlled bursts as he raised his arm, muscles tensed for the killing stroke. Jordan's eyes snapped open, survival instincts honed by months of constant vigilance in this hostile environment. Pure instinct drove him to roll sideways as the blade sliced through the air where his neck had been seconds before. His elbow caught the guard's wrist with desperate force, sending the knife clattering across the floor and spinning into the shadows. The impact jarred through both men's bodies. "He's trying to kill Carter." An inmate's voice shattered the midnight silence, raw with urgency. Others joined in, their shouts echoing off the walls as Jordan grappled with his attacker, both men locked in a life-or-death struggle. The sound of rattling bars filled the cell block as prisoners banged against their cells in protest, creating a deafening chorus of metal on metal. The guard's face twisted with frustration and barely contained rage as he realized his window of opportunity was closing. His eyes darted toward the entrance, calculating his escape. He broke free from Jordan's grip and backed toward the door, his uniform disheveled and damp with sweat. "You were never supposed to make it to trial," he hissed through clenched teeth before disappearing into the shadows of the corridor, leaving behind the bitter taste of failed vengeance. Heavy footsteps thundered down the corridor as other guards arrived, their faces masks of false concern and practiced innocence. Light flooded the cell as they flipped switches. What happened here? They asked questions they already knew the answers to, writing reports that would never tell the truth, their pens scratching against paper with deliberate slowness. Their eyes avoided the knife still lying in the corner. In Washington, Elliot Hayes' phone lit up with an encrypted message, its blue glow illuminating his worried face in the darkness of his study. Monroe put a hit on Carter. $50,000 dead. Clocks ticking. Decades of political experience told him this was only the beginning. The stakes had never been higher. His fingers trembled as he dialed the private line to the Oval Office, knowing the stakes had just risen exponentially. The phone felt slick in his sweating palm. "Mr. President, they just tried to kill him. We need to move him now." Sweat beaded on his forehead as he waited for the response, each second stretching into eternity. The president's response was immediate and decisive, his voice carrying the full weight of executive authority through the secure line. "Get him to a federal safe house. I'm signing the order now. Monroe's gone too far this time." The words carried both promise and warning. The system that had protected Monroe for so long was finally turning against him. The police van's headlights cut through the darkness as it sped down the empty highway, flanked by 2 federal escort vehicles. Inside, Jordan pressed his forehead against the cool window, watching the trees blur past in an endless parade of shadows. His wrists ached from the handcuffs. Protocol, they'd said, even though he was now under federal protection. The metal bit into his skin with every bump in the road, a constant reminder of how quickly his life had changed. He thought of his classroom, his students, his daughter, all of it feeling like a distant dream now. The lead agent checked his mirrors for the 10th time, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air. A black SUV hung back in the distance, just visible in the dim moonlight, maintaining the same steady gap no matter how much they varied their speed. Something about its presence set his teeth on edge. He'd been doing this job long enough to know when something wasn't right. The highway curved ahead, revealing a wall of vehicles blocking both lanes, their dark shapes forming an ominous barrier. Before anyone could react, muzzle flashes lit up the night like deadly fireflies. Bullets pinged off metal as the federal agents scrambled for cover, returning fire from behind their car doors, their shouts echoing across the empty road. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and burning rubber. The van swerved violently as rounds pierced the windshield, spiderwebbing the glass. The driver slumped forward, blood spreading across his shirt in a dark stain. The vehicle spun out of control, tires screaming against asphalt before flipping onto its side with a deafening crash of metal and glass. Jordan's world turned upside down as he was thrown against the ceiling, then slammed back down, his shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. His ears rang with the chaos of screeching metal and shattering glass. Smoke filled his lungs as he crawled toward the shattered rear doors, each movement sending shards of pain through his body. Blood trickled down his face from a cut above his eye, warm and sticky. Through the haze, he made out dark figures approaching, their boots crunching on broken glass. The sound grew closer with each passing second. His heart pounded against his ribs as he fought to stay conscious. The whine of approaching sirens pierced the air, growing louder by the moment. Red and blue lights flooded the scene as federal reinforcement vehicles screamed around the bend, their tires throwing up gravel. The masked gunmen scattered like cockroaches in sudden light, retreating to their vehicles and peeling away into the darkness, leaving only tire tracks and spent shell casings behind. The air still crackled with tension and the lingering echo of gunfire. In Washington, Elliot Hayes stood in his office watching the surveillance footage of the attack play across multiple screens. His jaw clenched as he rewound the video, studying the precision of the ambush. The tactical formation, the timing. This was no random attack. His fingers drummed against his desk as his mind raced through the implications. Years of political experience told him this kind of coordination came from somewhere high up. "This isn't just about Jordan anymore," he said, his voice tight with anger. "This is a war." His words hung heavy in the air, carrying the weight of a truth he'd suspected but hoped to avoid. The memory of his own brush with death in Crestwood years ago surfaced unbidden, strengthening his resolve to see this through to the end. Judge Monroe slumped in his leather chair, ice clinking against crystal as he poured another whiskey, his third of the hour. The news footage played on repeat, the ambushed van, the gunfire, the federal agents swarming the scene like angry hornets. His hands shook violently as he lifted the glass to his lips, spilling drops of amber liquid onto his silk tie, the stains spreading like blood across the expensive fabric. Years of power, of absolute control over Crestwood, crumbling before his eyes like a sandcastle in the tide. The empire he'd built through decades of careful manipulation was dissolving faster than he could process. His phone buzzed, making him flinch. Senator Williams's name flashed on the screen, a name that once brought comfort, but now filled him with dread. His stomach churned as he answered. "Gerald, it's over. The feds have sealed indictments. They're coming for everyone, judges, officers, everyone who helped you maintain your grip on power. The evidence is overwhelming." Monroe's glass shattered against the wall, sending crystal shards and whiskey spraying across his law degrees and family photos, the fragments catching the evening light like tiny daggers. "You promised me protection. We had a deal. I've kept your secrets for 20 years. Nobody can protect you now. You're toxic, Gerald. You're on your own." The line went dead with a finality that made his stomach turn, the silence deafening in his plush office. Panic clawed at his chest like a trapped animal as he dialed his son's number with trembling fingers, sweat beading on his forehead. David answered on the third ring, his voice cold and distant, carrying none of the respect that Monroe had demanded all these years. "I need your help. There's a property in Mexico, papers ready. We can disappear tonight, start fresh. I can explain everything." "No." David's voice was firm, carrying years of suppressed judgment and barely contained disgust. "I'm done covering for you, done being part of this. I've watched you destroy too many lives. I'm your father. Everything I did was for this family, to protect our legacy. You're a monster, and I won't help you escape justice. It ends now." David hung up, leaving Monroe alone with his crumbling empire, surrounded by the symbols of power that now meant nothing. One by one, Monroe's phone lit up with news alerts, each one a nail in his coffin. Sheriff Caldwell arrested trying to flee state lines, caught at a gas station looking disheveled and terrified. 3 judges indicted on corruption charges. His carefully constructed network of corruption unraveling thread by thread, leaving him exposed to the harsh light of justice. His hands trembled as he called his private pilot, desperation bleeding into his voice, his usual commanding tone replaced by barely concealed panic. "Get the plane ready. Now no questions, and destroy your phone after this call." In a secure safe house miles away, Jordan sat on the edge of his bed, fresh bandages wrapped around his shoulder where the bullets had grazed him, the white gauze a stark contrast against his dark skin. Elliot Hayes stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the setting sun as he watched federal agents patrol the perimeter with military precision, their weapons at the ready. "The whole system's falling apart," Elliot said, turning to face Jordan with grim satisfaction, his eyes bright with vindication. "But we need your testimony to finish this, to make sure what happened to you never happens to another soul in Crestwood. Your words will be the final blow." Jordan touched the purple bruises on his face, remembering the ambush, the years of systemic injustice that had brought them to this moment. Each mark told a story of survival. "When do we start?" "I'm ready. The truth needs to be heard." Monroe's expensive shoes clicked against the private airstrip's tarmac as he rushed toward his waiting plane, briefcase stuffed with cash clutched to his chest like a shield. Freedom was minutes away. The engines roared to life, the wheels lifted off, and then he heard it. The unmistakable sound of fighter jets cutting through the night sky, their engines drowning out his last hopes of escape. The radio crackled with authority, leaving no room for negotiation. "This is the United States Air Force. You are ordered to land immediately. This is your only warning. Comply or face immediate intervention." The military base's floodlights cast harsh shadows across Monroe's face as the plane touched down, the bright beams cutting through the darkness like accusing fingers. His hands gripped the armrests, knuckles white and trembling slightly, watching FBI vehicles converge on the runway like wolves circling their prey, their red and blue lights painting the tarmac in alternating colors. Sweat trickled down his temple as the reality of his situation finally sank in. The plane door opened with a hiss of pressurized air. Armed agents swarmed the steps, their weapons trained on the doorway, faces set with grim determination. Monroe emerged, his expensive Italian suit wrinkled from the flight, his silver hair disheveled and damp with nervous sweat. The mighty judge looked small and frail against the backdrop of military might, his shoulders hunched in defeat. His usual commanding presence had evaporated, leaving behind only a shell of the man who'd ruled Crestwood with an iron fist. "Gerald Monroe, you're under arrest." An FBI agent stepped forward, handcuffs gleaming under the harsh lights. His voice carried across the quiet airfield, firm and unwavering. Other agents moved in closer, their boots crunching on the tarmac. Monroe's lip curled into a sneer as the cold metal closed around his wrists with a decisive click. "You think this changes anything? Another man will take my place." His voice shook with barely contained rage, but the tremor in his words betrayed the fear he tried so desperately to hide. Across America, television screens lit up with breaking news, millions of viewers witnessing history unfold. Jordan watched from his safe house as reporters detailed Monroe's spectacular fall, their voices barely containing their excitement. Decades of corruption exposed, hundreds of cases under review, a system of oppression crumbling like a house of cards. Social media exploded with reactions, hashtags trending worldwide as people shared their own stories of injustice. Outside courthouses nationwide, crowds gathered in the growing tension. Some waved Confederate flags, defending the old order Monroe represented, their angry voices rising in protest. Others celebrated with songs and cheers, their signs demanding justice and reform held high against the evening sky. Candlelight vigils sprang up spontaneously, their warm glow a symbol of hope in the darkness. The president addressed the nation from the Oval Office, his face grave as he announced sweeping judicial reforms. Today marks the beginning of a new era of accountability in our justice system. His words echoed through living rooms across the country. Behind him, the American flag stood as a silent witness to this historic moment. In a stark jail cell, David Monroe faced his father across a metal table bolted to the floor. Gone were the expensive suits and air of authority that had defined Judge Monroe for decades. Gerald Monroe wore orange now, but his eyes still burned with the same cold fury that had terrorized Crestwood for years. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across both their faces. "You betrayed me, boy." Monroe's voice dripped with venom, his hands clenched into tight fists on the table. The veins in his neck stood out like cords. David met his father's gaze steadily, showing no fear. "No, I saved myself." His words carried the weight of years of silent suffering. In that moment, he felt lighter than he had in decades. The morning sun painted the courthouse steps gold as Jordan stepped into freedom, breathing deeply of his first truly free air in months. His daughter Naya's feet barely touched the ground as she ran, launching herself into his arms with a cry of pure joy. Tears streamed down both their faces as they held each other tight, making up for lost time. Her small hands clutched at his shirt as if afraid he might disappear again. Beside them stood the people who'd fought for this moment. Ava, his sister who'd risked everything to find the truth, her eyes shining with pride. Maya, whose courage had sparked a movement that changed the nation. And Elliot, who'd used his power to protect justice instead of privilege, standing tall with satisfaction. They formed a protective circle around Jordan and Nia, their faces glowing with triumph and relief. Jordan looked up at the courthouse, its shadow no longer as threatening in the morning light. "We're not done yet," he whispered, his voice filled with quiet determination. The warm breeze carried his words away, a promise to all those still waiting for justice. The historic D.C. courtroom buzzed with tension as spectators filled every available seat, the air thick with anticipation. Journalists scribbled furiously in notepads while activists and former victims of Monroe's corruption sat shoulder to shoulder with government officials, their faces etched with years of pain and determination. Camera shutters clicked rapidly as bailiffs led Gerald Monroe into the courtroom, his bright orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to his usual judicial robes. The chains around his wrists clinked with each shuffling step, a sound that echoed through the hushed chamber. Federal prosecutors laid out their case methodically, presenting evidence of Monroe's decades-long reign of terror over Crestwood. Documents flashed across screens showing falsified verdicts, backroom deals with private prison companies, and bank statements revealing mysterious payments that traced back to convicted criminals. The attempted hit on Jordan Carter drew shocked gasps from the gallery, followed by angry murmurs. Elliot Hayes took the stand, his testimony carrying the weight of both personal experience and political authority. His hands were steady as he gripped the microphone. "I watched Monroe destroy lives for years," he stated, his voice unwavering. "He didn't just bend the law, he broke it completely. He turned our justice system into his personal weapon." The courtroom fell silent as Hank Wilkins, the courthouse janitor, shuffled to the witness stand. His weathered hands trembled as he gripped the railing, but his eyes held a fierce determination that hadn't been there before. "I heard them planning it all," Wilkins testified, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Judge Monroe and Sheriff Caldwell right there in his chambers. They picked Jordan Carter because he was getting too influential with the kids, teaching them about their rights. Said they needed to make an example. I cleaned those floors for 40 years, hearing their schemes, watching them hurt people. Not anymore." Ava Carter approached the evidence table, holding the rescued document with steady hands. Her face showed no emotion, but her eyes blazed with purpose. The prosecution displayed it on the screens. Monroe's signature clear on falsified verdicts, proof of his direct manipulation of justice. The evidence was damning and undeniable. Monroe's defense attorney rose, his argument hollow and desperate. "My client exercised appropriate judicial discretion in all cases," he claimed, but the mountain of evidence told a different story. The gallery's collective scoff was audible. The jury returned after just 3 hours of deliberation. "Guilty," rang out across the courtroom, count after count. Monroe stood stone-faced as the verdicts were read, his facade of power crumbling with each declaration. As officers led him away, Monroe locked eyes with Jordan, his lips curved into a defiant smirk. "This country doesn't change, Carter. You'll see." His voice dripped with venom and bitter defeat. Jordan watched in dignified silence as Monroe disappeared through the courtroom doors, knowing that change had already begun. Jordan's footsteps echoed through the empty hallway as he approached his classroom, each step stirring dust motes that danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. The familiar scent of chalk dust and old textbooks filled his nose, bringing back a rush of memories from his years of teaching. The laughter, the breakthroughs, the countless moments of connection. He pushed open the door, running his fingers along the smooth wooden desk where he'd spent countless hours teaching, grading papers, and mentoring students who needed extra help, feeling every scratch and dent that told its own story. The chalkboard stretched before him blank and waiting, like an empty canvas yearning to be filled with knowledge. His hand trembled as he picked up a piece of chalk, memories of his last lesson flooding back, the confusion on his students' faces when the officers had arrived, the cold click of handcuffs against his wrists, the whispers that had followed him out. "Mr. Carter?" Maya's voice came from the doorway, soft but confident. She held a reporter's notebook, her press badge gleaming on her chest, looking every bit the professional journalist she'd dreamed of becoming when she sat in his class years ago. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she carried herself with newfound authority. "I hoped I'd find you here. Look at you, all professional now." Jordan smiled warmly, setting down the chalk and feeling a surge of pride for his former student. The transformation from eager high school journalist to accomplished reporter filled his heart. "That badge suits you. The Washington Post hired me to cover Monroe's case. But that's not why I'm here." Her voice carried the same determination he remembered from his classroom, the fire that had made her such a remarkable student. In the town square, music played as people gathered to celebrate Monroe's conviction, their joy spilling into every corner of the space. Children ran with sparklers while their parents chatted in small groups, the atmosphere electric with joy and relief. The sweet smell of cotton candy mixed with the warmth of the summer evening. Jordan stood with Elliot Hayes on the courthouse steps, watching the festivities below, still processing the reality of their victory after so many months of struggle. 200 cases, Elliot said, handing Jordan a thick file, his hands shaking with barely contained anger that had been building for decades. Each one manipulated by Monroe. Some of these men have been in prison for decades, missing birthdays, funerals, whole lifetimes, moments they'll never get back. Jordan flipped through the pages, his heart heavy with each revelation. Names, dates, falsified evidence, lives destroyed by one man's corruption. Each page told a story of justice denied, of families torn apart, of dreams crushed under the weight of prejudice and power. "The federal investigation uncovered more than we imagined," Elliot continued, his voice tight with emotion, years of suppressed rage finally finding its voice. Monroe wasn't just rigging trials. He was building an empire on broken lives, profiting from every wrongful conviction, turning pain into power. Jordan closed the file with quiet determination, his decision already made. He stepped up to the microphone that had been set up for the celebration, adjusting it with steady hands that belied the gravity of the moment. "Monroe's conviction isn't the end," he announced, his voice carrying across the square like a clarion call. The crowd fell silent, faces turning toward him with expectation, hope shining in their eyes. There are hundreds of innocent men still behind bars, men who never got a fair trial, men who lost everything because one corrupt judge decided their fate. He gripped the podium, his voice growing stronger with conviction and purpose, drawing strength from the very community that had once doubted him. "I'm going to fight for every single one of them. We're going to tear down the system Monroe built, brick by brick, case by case. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone Monroe buried under the law, and we won't rest until they all get justice." Jordan sat at a long conference table, surrounded by stacks of case files and a team of dedicated lawyers who had volunteered their time. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across faces etched with determination. Empty coffee cups littered the table, testament to the long hours they'd been working. Papers rustled as tired hands turned page after page, searching for the truth buried in decades of lies. Elliot paced behind them, his phone constantly buzzing with calls from media outlets eager to cover what they dubbed the Crestwood Project. His face showed both exhaustion and fierce purpose, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. "Each case tells the same story," one of the lawyers said, spreading photographs across the table. "Fabricated evidence, coerced testimonies, rushed trials. Some of these men didn't even get proper legal representation. The pattern is impossible to ignore." She tapped her pen against a particularly troubling document, her knuckles white with anger. The team worked through nights and weekends, fueled by coffee and righteous anger. They pored over yellowed documents, cross-referenced testimonies, and uncovered patterns of corruption that stretched back decades. Empty pizza boxes piled up in corners as they built their case, piece by devastating piece. Their efforts paid off as, one by one, cell doors opened and broken men stepped into sunlight for the first time in decades. On a crisp autumn morning, Jordan stood outside the state prison, waiting for Joseph Whitaker. The old man emerged slowly, clutching a small cardboard box containing his only possessions, squinting at the brightness of day. His hair had gone completely white during his 40 years behind bars, his shoulders stooped from decades of prison labor. The prison uniform hung loose on his thin frame, swaying in the gentle breeze. "Mr. Whitaker." Jordan extended his hand, his heart heavy with the weight of all those lost years. The morning sun caught the silver at his temples, a reminder of how time had passed for them all. Joseph's weathered fingers trembled as he grasped Jordan's hand. Tears streamed down his lined face, leaving tracks in skin that hadn't felt rain in 40 years. "I never thought I'd see freedom. My grandchildren. They've grown up without ever knowing me." His voice cracked with emotion, decades of pain spilling out in those few words. The moment sparked a movement. Citizens packed town halls across the state, demanding reform. They carried signs and shared stories of their own encounters with corruption. Young and old, from every background, they stood together, their voices growing stronger each day. Legislators who had ignored the problem for years suddenly found themselves facing angry constituents armed with evidence of systemic corruption. That evening, Jordan found an envelope on his doorstep. No return address, no postmark. Inside, a single typed note read, "You took down Monroe, but you have no idea how deep this goes. Be careful who you trust." The paper trembled slightly in his hands as he realized this fight was far from over. He glanced over his shoulder at the darkening street, wondering who else might be watching from the shadows. Jordan spread the anonymous letter on his desk, studying the crisp typeface for any clues. Maps and documents covered his office walls, red strings connecting faces to places, building a web of corruption that grew more complex by the day. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his work, highlighting the dust particles floating in the air. His fingers traced the paper's edge, feeling for any distinguishing marks, while his tired eyes scanned each carefully typed line for hidden meanings or patterns, searching for anything that might reveal the sender's identity. The weight of sleepless nights showed in the dark circles under his eyes, but determination kept him going. Ava leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, concern etched across her face. Her fingers drummed anxiously against her sleeve as she watched her brother work. The familiar gesture betrayed her growing worry about his obsession with the case. "You've done enough, Jordan. You're free now. Maybe it's time to get back to teaching, to Naya. She misses you. We all do." "I can't walk away. Not when I know there's more." He tapped the letter, determination hardening his voice. The familiar fire of purpose burned in his eyes, the same fire she'd seen when he'd first decided to become a teacher. Someone risked reaching out. They're counting on me. These people need justice. In a dimly lit diner off the highway, Jordan met Frank Reeves, a former clerk who'd worked under Monroe for 20 years. Frank's hand shook as he stirred his coffee, eyes darting to the door every few minutes. The neon signs outside cast shifting shadows across his weathered face, highlighting the deep worry lines around his mouth. The late-night truckers and tired waitresses paid them no attention, creating the perfect cover for their clandestine meeting. Monroe wasn't special. Frank's voice barely rose above a whisper, nearly lost in the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. He hunched closer over the table, his coffee forgotten, the steam rising between them like a veil. He was just one node in the network. They call themselves the Southern Circuit, judges across 5 states, all working together. They share tactics, trade favors, protect each other. It's like a brotherhood with roots deeper than anyone suspects. How deep does it go? Private prisons, construction contracts, land deals? Every wrongful conviction feeds the machine. Monroe was just their man in Crestwood. Frank's shoulders hunched as if the weight of his secrets was physically crushing him. His hands wrapped tightly around his coffee cup, seeking warmth and comfort. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows on his face, making him look even more haunted. Back in his office, Jordan pinned new names to his wall, his hands moving with renewed purpose. Red strings stretched across state lines now, connecting judges, lawyers, prison officials. Each string represented lives destroyed, families torn apart. The wall had become a testament to decades of systematic injustice. He gripped his pen tight, staring at the expanding web of corruption, feeling the weight of responsibility settling deeper into his bones. The setting sun painted the room in shades of orange and red, as if the wall itself was ablaze with the injustice it revealed. Monroe was just the beginning, he whispered to himself, knowing there was no turning back now. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. Behind him, the shadows lengthened, a silent reminder of the darkness he was fighting against. The midnight hours crept by as Jordan sat in his dimly lit office, surrounded by the evidence of a corruption that stretched far beyond Crestwood's borders. Red strings crisscrossed the wall like blood vessels, connecting faces and places across 5 states. Each thread told a story of lives destroyed for profit, of justice perverted into a business model. The weight of what he'd uncovered pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. His fingers traced the edges of yet another damning document, another piece of evidence that showed just how deep this corruption went. Ava's footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway before she appeared in the doorway, a cup of coffee clutched in her hands. Steam rose from the mug, carrying the rich aroma of her special dark roast blend. Her face tightened at the sight of her brother, still working despite the late hour. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, testament to sleepless nights spent unraveling this web of deceit. The familiar worry lines around her mouth deepened as she watched him work. "Monroe's gone. You've done enough. Why keep digging?" Her voice carried a mix of concern and frustration. She stepped into the room, placing the coffee beside his scattered papers. Jordan traced a line between 2 photographs, his finger following the path of corruption. The paper crinkled beneath his touch, worn from countless hours of examination. Because if we don't, they'll just replace him with someone worse. The system's too broken to leave alone. His voice was soft, but determined, carrying the weight of countless injustices he'd discovered. The next day, in a wood-paneled office in Washington, D.C., Jordan spread his findings across Elliot Hayes's massive mahogany desk. The polished surface reflected the documents like a dark mirror. The Secretary of State studied each document with the careful attention of a man who'd spent decades navigating political minefields, his expression growing darker with each revelation. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting stripes across the thick carpet. "Look at these patterns," Jordan pointed to a series of case numbers, his finger tapping urgently against the paper. His voice carried an intensity that made Hayes lean forward. "The same judges, the same private prisons, the same companies benefiting every time. It's all connected. These aren't coincidences." Hayes leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. His eyes held a mixture of admiration and worry as he studied Jordan's determined face. "If you go after this, you're making enemies far more powerful than Monroe. They won't let you take them down so easily. These people have friends in every corner of Washington." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "They'll fight back with everything they have." That evening, the crash of breaking glass shattered the quiet of Jordan's home, sending his heart racing. A brick lay among the scattered shards on his living room floor, wrapped in a note that read, "Drop it or else." The threat hung in the air like poison, making the familiar comfort of his home feel suddenly alien and hostile. Later that night, as Jordan sifted through another stack of files, his desk lamp casting a warm circle of light in the darkness, a name caught his eye. Hidden in Monroe's records was a recurring signature, Senator Alan Prescott. Jordan's breath caught as the pieces clicked into place, his hands trembling slightly as he connected this new revelation to everything else he'd discovered. This wasn't just about corrupt local judges anymore. The trail led straight to Washington, to the very halls of power he'd visited that morning. His heart pounded as he realized just how high this conspiracy reached and how dangerous his pursuit of justice had become. The knock on Jordan's office door came well past midnight. His hand instinctively reached for his phone, ready to call security, but something made him pause. Through the frosted glass, he recognized David Monroe's silhouette, the familiar slope of his shoulders bearing an unusual heaviness tonight. The dim hallway lights cast long shadows across the floor, making the moment feel even more ominous. David stepped inside, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face drawn with exhaustion. The weight of betraying his father's legacy showed in every line of his face, in the slight tremor of his usually steady hands. His tie hung loose around his neck and dark circles shadowed his eyes. Without a word, he pulled a small USB drive from his pocket and placed it on Jordan's desk, the tiny device looking impossibly small for the magnitude of what it contained. "This has names, transactions, proof, everything my father kept hidden." David's voice cracked, his fingers drumming nervously against his thigh. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. "But if you go public with this, you'll never have a normal life again. They'll come after you with everything they have. The people involved, they don't play fair." Jordan picked up the drive, turning it over in his hands, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. The small piece of plastic felt warm against his palm. "Why now?" "Because someone needs to stop them, and you're the only one who's gotten this far." David's eyes met Jordan's, carrying years of buried guilt and newfound resolve. His shoulders straightened slightly, as if unburdening himself had already lifted some of the weight he carried. In Elliot Hayes's private office, Jordan watched the Secretary of State's face darken as he scrolled through the files. Names of judges, politicians, and business leaders filled the screen, a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of government. The soft glow of the monitor cast shadows across Elliot's weathered features. Coffee cups littered his desk, evidence of the long hours they'd spent reviewing the explosive information. "Some of these people," Elliot shook his head, his finger pausing over familiar names. His hand trembled slightly as he recognized colleagues he'd trusted for years. "We need to be smart about this. If we go public the wrong way, they'll bury it. They've done it before. I've seen it happen." That night, as Senator Prescott reviewed the security briefing about Jordan's investigation, his jaw clenched. His manicured fingers gripped the report until the pages crumpled. The desk lamp cast harsh shadows across his face as he reached for his phone. Two shadows slipped through the darkness toward Jordan's office building, moving with practiced efficiency. Glass shattered. Papers flew. Filing cabinets crashed to the floor, the sound of destruction echoing through empty hallways. They worked methodically, ensuring nothing of value remained intact. Jordan's phone rang as he stood in his destroyed office the next morning, surrounded by broken glass and torn files. Sunlight streamed through the broken windows, creating a kaleidoscope of light and shadow. The morning air carried the acrid smell of burned paper and spilled ink. The voice on the other end was cold, mechanical. "Walk away, Carter. You got your victory. Don't push your luck." Jordan stared at the destruction around him, his reflection fractured in the shards of glass at his feet, each piece showing a different version of the man he'd become. The morning light caught the edges of the USB drive in his pocket, a reminder that sometimes the smallest things could bring down the mightiest walls. In a dimly lit basement office of a local church, Jordan sat with his closest allies around a weathered oak table. Maya's laptop cast a blue glow across their faces as they reviewed the explosive contents of David Monroe's USB drive. The air was thick with tension and the musty scent of old hymnals. Ava paced behind them, her footsteps echoing against the concrete walls, each step betraying her growing anxiety. The sound of rain hitting the small window added to the room's somber atmosphere. "The evidence is solid," Elliot said, adjusting his tie and leaning closer to the screen. "Bank transfers, emails, court documents, everything we need to expose the whole operation." They were careless, thinking they'd never be caught. His fingers traced the edge of a particularly damning document, a half smile playing on his lips. "But going public?" Ava stopped pacing, her hands gripping the back of Jordan's chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. "They've already tried to kill you once. I can't." Her voice cracked, heavy with emotion. "I don't want to lose my brother again." She squeezed Jordan's shoulder, the gesture speaking volumes about their newly rebuilt relationship. Maya leaned forward, her eyes bright with determination, the screen's glow reflecting off her face. "If we don't do this, how many more Jordan Carters will they create? How many more families will they destroy? We have to break this cycle." Her fingers flew across the keyboard, organizing the evidence into a compelling narrative. The weight of the decision pressed down on Jordan's shoulders like a physical burden. He stood up, walked to the small window near the ceiling, watching feet pass by on the sidewalk above. Each pair of shoes represented someone affected by this corrupt system. Mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, all victims of injustice. A child skipped past, reminding him of his own daughter and the world he wanted to create for her. After a long moment, he turned back to the group, his expression resolute. "Call the networks, set up the press conference. It's time people knew the truth." His voice carried the quiet strength that had made him such an effective teacher. In Washington, Senator Prescott sat in his leather chair, watching CNN's breaking news alert. His face remained perfectly still as he watched Jordan Carter step up to a podium covered in microphones, though his fingers drummed an irregular rhythm on his armrest. A half-empty glass of bourbon sat untouched on his desk. Jordan's voice rang clear through the speakers, steady and determined as a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. He laid out the evidence methodically: names, dates, transactions. He exposed the network of corrupt judges who had profited from false convictions, their schemes laid bare for all to see. He revealed the politicians who had protected them, naming names without hesitation. His hands remained steady on the podium, his eyes never wavering from the cameras. The world watched, transfixed, as decades of corruption came crashing down in a single broadcast. Social media exploded with shares and comments. News anchors fell silent, their usual commentary forgotten. In living rooms and offices across America, people stood frozen, witnessing history unfold, many wiping tears from their eyes. Phones buzzed with notifications as Maya's carefully crafted hashtag began trending nationwide. "This ends today," Jordan declared, his words echoing across the nation, carrying the weight of truth and the promise of change. Behind him, Ava stood tall and proud, finally at peace with her decision to return home and fight alongside her brother. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Jordan stood before the gleaming new building, its fresh paint catching the morning light. The Carter Justice Foundation's sign hung proudly above the entrance, each letter a testament to the change one person could bring. People streamed in and out, lawyers carrying thick case files, former inmates seeking help, volunteers ready to make a difference. The buzz of activity filled the air with hope and purpose, reminding Jordan of his classroom days when students had eagerly filled the halls with similar energy. Inside, phones rang constantly with calls from across the country, the steady hum of voices mixing with the clicking of keyboards and shuffling of papers. The foundation had already helped overturn 30 wrongful convictions in just 3 months, working tirelessly day and night. Young law students volunteered their time, poring over old cases with fresh eyes and determination. Each empty cell represented a family reunited, a life restored, a small piece of justice returned to the world. Monroe's fall had sent shockwaves through the judicial system, exposing cracks that had been hidden for decades. He spent his days in a federal prison, the same kind where he'd sent countless innocent men, his power and influence now nothing more than a bitter memory. The guards said he kept to himself, barely speaking to anyone, a far cry from the man who once commanded a courtroom with fear. Senator Prescott faced mounting evidence against him, though his powerful friends worked overtime to shield him from consequences. But the tide had turned. Elliott's new oversight bill meant judges could no longer operate in shadows, their decisions now subject to unprecedented scrutiny and public review. Jordan drove to the cemetery, where fallen leaves carpeted the ground between headstones in shades of red and gold. The crisp air carried the scent of earth and autumn as he knelt before 3 graves, his mother, father, and grandfather Nathaniel. The flowers he placed seemed bright against the gray stone, their petals dancing in the gentle wind. A cardinal landed nearby, its red feathers bright against the somber backdrop. "You were right," he whispered to his grandfather's headstone, touching the cold marble with gentle fingers. "Sometimes one person has to stand up first, and others will follow." Maya walked up beside him, her notebook tucked under her arm, her footsteps soft on the leaf-covered ground. She'd been documenting everything since the beginning, determined to tell the full story, to make sure no detail was forgotten. Her article series had already won several awards, but she cared more about the changes it had sparked. "Do you ever think about what Monroe said? That another man will take his place?" Her voice was thoughtful, carrying the weight of everything they'd witnessed. Jordan looked up at the clear sky, a faint smile crossing his face as sunlight warmed his skin. "Maybe. But now, they know someone will be there to stop them. That makes all the difference. The truth always finds its way out." He crossed the cemetery to where Nia waited by an old oak tree, her backpack full of drawings she'd made for her grandparents. She had grown so much in the past year, becoming more aware of the world around her and her place in it. Jordan lifted her into his arms, holding her close as the setting sun painted Crestwood in shades of gold, brighter than ever before, promising a future where justice wasn't just a word, but a reality they would keep fighting to protect. If you enjoyed the story of Jordan, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. If you enjoyed the story of Jordan, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.